Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is presented by Sports Field Management Association. This is the fourth and final week of our four-part series of post-conference education. Our featured speakers today are Dr. Jim Brosnan and Dr. Gerald Henry. Dr. Brosnan is a professor in the Plant Sciences Department at the University of Tennessee and director of their Weed Diagnostics Center. His research focuses on effective and economical strategies for controlling turfgrass weeds, particularly those evolving resistance to herbicides. Dr. Gerald Henry is the Athletic Association Endowed Professor of Environmental Turfgrass Science at the University of Georgia. He is the director of the Athens Turfgrass Research and Education Center, the undergraduate coordinator for the Department of Crop and Soil Sciences, and the director of the UGA Turfgrass Management Program. Today, they will be presenting developing weed control strategies for your facility. Attendees will be muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature and they will be answered throughout the presentation. Thank you for joining us today. You can go ahead and get started.
All right, thank you, Kristen. So I guess the challenge right now is that we only have an hour, and trying to discuss weed control strategies for both cool and warm season areas is a little difficult. So I tried to create a presentation that was somewhat linear, and obviously it's going to probably lead to several questions specifically about controlling, weed A in turfgrass species, B, which if you have any of those questions as we go through, just feel free to type them in and we'll try to answer them as quickly as possible. So obviously, Jim and I both work in areas where we are confronted with all different levels of sports fields. And a lot of my work is conducted on K through 12 community sports fields. And it's not uncommon to run across a field that looks like this, that has a pretty good hefty weed infestation. But one of the things to note here is that this field specifically has a pretty good monoculture of one specific weed, a plantain. And a lot of my background has to do with weed ecology. And, the two of us know that most weeds have preferred environments. And usually when you have a large monoculture of a specific weed that pops up over time, it indicates that there's some sort of underlying agronomic problem. And a lot of times changes to cultural practices or some of the agronomic conditions that exist in that system can help reduce weed pressure. And that all sort of plays into the emphasis of using IPM strategies when it comes to trying to control your weeds in your turfgrass systems. So I'm sure anyone that's taken a disease course has come across the disease triangle, and you know that in order for disease to exist, you need to have a pathogen present, a susceptible host, and then obviously the preferred environment for that pathogen to infect the turfgrass. And so we kind of take the same stance with weeds, is trying to sort of eliminate that environment that may, end up making it easier for that weed to outcompete some of the turf. So here's a picture of a typical athletic field that is suffering from a lot of wear and stress. And we know that, open turf is usually an indicator of potential soil compaction issues, overuse, traffic, and wear, and things like that. And a lot of times that leads to the occurrence of something like goosegrass. So we know goosegrass, it doesn't necessarily prefer this situation, but it's tolerant to grow in these types of conditions where the turf grasses are thin, open, and they're not as competitive as they would be if the issue with soil compaction was alleviated. So not only goosegrass, but there's lots of other weeds that are indicators of some sort of underlying condition or maybe a deficiency in your management scheme. So with respect to soil compaction, it may be goosegrass, it may be knotweed, it may be khaki weed, or there's various others. Low soil nitrogen, clover species, black medic, and lespedeza. And even droughty soils, you see a lot of spurge, again, black medic, knotweed, and yellow wood sorrel. So again, talking about weeds as indicators, if you see one plant, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have an underlying issue, but if you start to see a shift in the species presence within your field or fields, that may actually indicate some sort of underlying condition that you might be able to alleviate or change and increase turf competition and decrease weed pressure.
And if I can interject here really quickly, Gerald, this is a really important piece of information because, we go to conferences and we seek information about how to fix a weed control problem, and, it'd be really easy to just focus on the end, the what do I spray? And we'll talk about that in this presentation. And at the end of today's session, we'll go through some of the new herbicide options you might see for sports field use in 2022. But that at some level is just putting a Band-Aid on a larger problem. And if you want to get to a point where you are spraying less frequently, understanding some of these kind of causal factors that are leading the weeds to be there, they need to be remedied in order to make your reliance on chemistry later maybe a little bit less than it would be in the alternative scenario. So talking about measuring some of these variables that we're going to do now is really key.
Yeah, definitely. So again, I do more than just weed science. A lot of what I do is performance testing and player safety, and we try to measure both plants and agronomic variables of a lot of these systems. And I'm going to show you some of this just simply to kind of show you how these are all linked together and how they can have an impact on the potential for weed pressure, or even just show you how they can degrade the turf grass system. So lots of things that we can measure out there. Obviously, Jim and I have some fancy equipment that we can take some of these measurements pretty quickly and easily, but there are devices that are still out there that are more affordable now, and some of them are GPS compatible that you can actually take some data, make some maps, and do some of this stuff on your own. So looking at measurable variables, you've got soil moisture and compaction, surface hardness, turf grass health, shear strength, and even turf grass thatch. And we even look at things like rooting and a few others as well. So one of the things I try to talk about quite a bit when I talk to people about sports field management in general is variability. And it's occurring when a measured quantity is different across fields and between locations. So this is just a basic map showing you soil compaction differences among several different fields on the campus of UGA. And just sort of simply put, it's showing you soil compaction. You have areas that are not compacted that are sort of blue. And then as you get closer towards the oranges and the reds, your compaction is increasing. And it's pretty easy to see that you've got areas that are highly compacted and some areas that are not compacted at all. And I'll kind of talk about how that plays into some management techniques here in a second. So causes of variability, we can see natural occurrence of variability just as fields age. That's just a given. Field use is obviously one of the culprits here. When you look at the K through 12 scenarios, or even moving into some college athletics, we see a lot of overuse of fields, maybe poor field rotation, maybe trying to use too many different or use a field for too many different sports that affect the field differently. And then also your cultural practices. So some of the things that you're doing to the field, not only can they have a positive effect, but they can also have potentially a negative effect, especially if things aren't working properly. Like your irrigation system, or maybe if you make a inaccurate fertility application or something like that. So just want to show this pretty briefly, not get too much into this, but this is kind of showing you the links between variables. And this is some research that we did a few years ago here at UGA, where we measured all these different variables on a bunch of different fields, went through a bunch of statistical analysis. And what we're trying to do is show that there are interactions between a bunch of these variables. And some of these, there are influence others more strongly than others. And then there's either a negative interaction, or sometimes there's a positive interaction. I'm not going to get into this, but just to kind of show you that they're all linked to some extent with one another. And that can have an influence on some of the weeds that you do end up coming in contact with. So simply put, some of this work was published, and it states that plant soil properties greatly influence one another. You really can't control the variability that exists, but you need to come up with management options that account for the variability. So understanding that you may have some areas that are higher in soil moisture and some areas that are drier, and how that's going to affect your potential weed pressure in those two different distinct areas is what needs to be accounted for with your management tactics. And this is where we start to get into what we call site-specific management.
And before we jump into that really quickly, you may be listening today thinking like, you're not telling me anything I don't already know. I have all these factors on my field or fields. I know this. One of the points that we really want you to take home from today's session is communicating this to your leaders, whether that is the school that you're working at, maybe it's a Parks and Recs or a county director that you're working with. If it's a higher level field where there's a team or a university athletic department, communicating that to the people above you can really help you maybe get more resources to put into a field to do the things that you want to do weed management wise, but maybe you haven't had the resources available for you to do it. So that's one of the things where you can take this variability information and use it to your advantage to help your cause as you move forward in 2022 to try to do a little bit more with the services you manage.
Yeah, and I mean, we map a lot of fields, and we deal with some complexes that may have 20, 30 fields, and simply understanding what's going on in the fields that are used the most can be utilized to go to upper administration and say, look, we need to start rotating more fields. I understand that field 1, 2, and 3 are closest to the parking lot, but we are overutilizing these fields, creating some issues that we can't alleviate very easily, when in fact, if we rotated through some of the other fields, we wouldn't have these issues and management would be a lot easier. All right, so just kind of showing you some of the site-specific aerification. We've done some work here. This is actually some work from one of my former PhD students who's now a professor at Texas A&M, Chase Straw. And I kind of downgraded some of the slides that he had, but simply put, this is kind of showing you that if you have a map over here on the left, this is the before picture. Again, the more compacted areas are showing up in the yellows and the oranges. This entire plot here on the left, and I can't get my mouse to work that well, is not completely, heavily compacted. You have areas that are not compacted whatsoever here on the bottom right. And what this is really trying to teach you is that there's no point in aerifying this entire area when you should focus your efforts on the areas that need the most attention. So the areas that are heavily compacted, and then, so you're using less resources, you're using less gas, you're using, you're putting less wear and tear on your equipment. And then, the end product on the right here is that you have not necessarily alleviated variability of soil compaction, but you have sort of smoothed that variability out to a certain extent, where now you have a field that performs somewhat similarly with respect to compaction, and you've only had to aerify a portion of it instead of conducting an entire aerification event, and potentially maybe loosening some of the areas that didn't need to be aerified whatsoever.
And maybe back into play sooner.
Yes. And again, there are certain situations where you can over manipulate an area and then create a problem in a different direction. So again, understanding where to put your efforts and really is sort of the foundation of site-specific management. So I share this slide quite a bit when I teach master gardener talks, and it's really about plant competition and why would we even want to control weeds. And obviously, there's a lot of competition that occurs between the desirable plants that you're trying to cultivate, and the weeds that are present. And that competition exists for a limited amount of resources. And it could be anything from light to water, nutrients, and space. And again, that's where adjustments to some of your cultural practices may increase the competitive advantage of the turf to alleviate some of the weed pressure. And then therefore, again, when we talk about control, chemical control down the road, it's a little easier maybe to get control because you have less weed pressure there. So in my opinion, the keys to successful weed control really boil down to correct weed ID. You definitely need to know who you're dealing with. And if I've had several instances where someone has called me up and asked me to come look at their field, thinking they had a resistance problem, when in fact they didn't ID the weed correctly. They sprayed a chemical to control one weed that wouldn't control the other. And it was a wasted application, and they didn't have a resistance issue after all. You really have to understand weed biology. I know that seems kind of simplistic, but if someone says, hey, I need you to come take a look at my crabgrass plants in the middle of December, I'm probably going to tell them, hey, that's probably not possible, because I know that it's a summer annual and it shouldn't be around in the wintertime, at least not necessarily where I am. So again, understanding the biology can also help you correctly identify weeds, but also understand how they're growing and how they may be susceptible to certain cultural and even chemical practices. Definitely want to use cultural practices to try and reduce weed populations. And then when it comes time for herbicide applications, you want to make sure you select the proper herbicide. You want to make sure your timing is correct with respect to trying to get the best control you can. And then obviously try to use the best application technique as well.
And these things can interplay together, right? I think, Gerald, maybe it was you who told me you had an extension visit once where somebody reached out to you and said that they had a broadleaf, they had a weed control failure. They had used a broadleaf herbicide to control a broadleaf weed and nothing was working. And it ended up that they were spraying Dallas grass, thinking that that was a broadleaf weed because the leaf was really wide, right? So that's weed ID and herbicide selection and weed biology all kind of wrapped up into one funny extension story.
It's usually not that bad, but that does happen. A lot of times it's mistaking, goosegrass for crabgrass and spraying a chemistry that just isn't as effective on crab as it is on goose. Not that there's a lot for goose anyway, but so that kind of brings me to the slide right here, which we've utilized from one of Jim's former students, who's now a professor up at Rutgers, Matt Elmore. Just kind of showing you some of the subtleties when it comes to trying to understand ID with respect to some of these really small plants. So I'm going to get into this a little bit later, but a lot of these difficult to control annual weeds that we don't have a lot of options for are easier to control when the plants are small. So if you can tell them apart when they're small, then you're going to have a better opportunity to spray a chemistry and then have it work. So goosegrass, I mean, again, smaller stage, it sort of has more of that blunt leaf tip to it, a little bit more rounded, whereas you do get sort of a subtle point with the crabgrass. Sometimes it's a little bit more or a little less subtle, depending upon whether it's large or smooth. But again, you're going to see that sort of points at the end or the tip there with the crabgrass, contrary to what you see with the goosegrass. And I know these are tough to pick out. I mean, I'm getting older, my eyes are pretty tough. But I mean, you kind of need to get down and into the canopy to look for some of these when they're at the early stage, again, so you can make a good application and have it be effective. So I'm sure anyone that's watching this right now has seen this type of slide before. I'm just looking at weed life cycles. And again, really trying to hammer home that it's important to understand the differences in some of the subtle differences. So summer annuals obviously germinate in the spring, grow in the summer and die in the fall. Winter annuals germinate in the fall, grow in the spring, typically die in the summer. And obviously your perennials have the ability to overwinter, and they typically resume growth from year to year. Sometimes as some of these perennials mature, they become a little bit easier to control. And sometimes when they're just starting out, they're a little easier to control. So, and we'll talk about a few weeds that sort of break, the rules when it comes to some of these life cycles as well. So talking about annual weeds, obviously your most common with most turfgrass situations are going to be your annual bluegrass, your crabgrass species, large and smooth, and then your goosegrass as well. You can throw in a few other grass weeds and then a few broadleaf weeds that become problematic. So the key thing here with annual weeds is that we know that they're establishing through seeds. So when it comes to cultural practices, you want to perform things in a timely fashion that will help eliminate reproduction from seed. So either germination or seed production in general. So we can try to reduce weed seed banks, by collecting clippings, when certain weeds are setting seed. This tends to work relatively well with annual bluegrass and a few others. And then obviously decreasing germination through adjustments in mowing height. I'm going to go through some examples. I understand that you can't increase your mowing height from 1 inch to 4 inches, and I don't expect anyone to maintain an athletic field like that. But for sake of argument, it's just kind of showing you, how some of these adjustments can actually make a difference, decrease weed pressure, and potentially make your herbicide applications, when you do use them, more effective. I don't know if you want to talk about phrase mowing real quick, since you do all this work, or.
Yeah, sure. I think most of you listening are familiar with phrase mowing and the concept of phrase mowing for kind of overall improving sports field quality. Our group started to work with this from a weed control standpoint a few years ago, thinking that, as we remove the uppermost layer of the field, from what we know about weeds and weed seed, particularly our annuals, a lot of that weed seed is going to be highly concentrated at the top of the soil surface, which is affected by the phrase mower. Here, this is a shot from that one slide you saw. We're phrase mowing Meyer zoysia grass, which isn't a sports field grass per se, but this was let's demonstrate the overall efficacy in a turf situation and see what we can find in reducing Poa annua in a warm season turf grass stand. So we did this work a few years ago, and you can get super aggressive with this if you want to. I mean, you can go down as deep as 2 inches, and it's a trade-off with how deep you go versus how quickly you can recover. I would say that the most current research that our group here has done and has been replicated in Florida, the depth that we feel the best about from balancing, okay, I'm going to mechanically remove annual weeds from my field and then get some Bermuda grass recovery, is probably a little bit over a 1/2 inch. I think we were 15 millimeters, which I think is like 0.6 inch depth. That was where we didn't see much of a weed control efficacy benefit from going any deeper, and we did get the best recovery between those two 15 and 30 millimeter depths that we worked with. I think there's more work to be done here, though. We've seen efficacy differences in turf type. You can see on the slide in zoysia grass when we first started this summer phrase mowing. So a summer phrase mowing event in June. We did this for 2 years on the same site. Overall, we had a 26% reduction in Poa annua cover the following spring. When we did this in Bermuda grass, the response was markedly higher. Overall reduction in Poa plants was much greater. Why that is, we're not sure of yet. I think there's a case to be made that some of that weed seed is maybe trapped in the thatch, and that's what we're affecting when we phrase mow more on one species than another. At the end of the day, this is certainly something that's going to help us move the needle forward with managing annual weeds. And the interest has come from the fact that some of our annuals, we have widespread herbicide resistance issues to the extent that a lot of our selective herbicide options aren't working to the extent that we would like. So we're moving into doing phrase mowing a lot more. You can move forward one slide if you want, Gerald. So that's a really quick, because we're so constrained on time. If we were together at the conference for 2 or 3 hours, we could go deep down the rabbit hole on phrase mowing. If anybody listening has phrase mowing questions and wants to go through the Q&A and chat box about it, happy to do that. And Gerald's going to take the baton from here and talk about mowing height work on crabgrass reduction. I think this is in fine fescue, and then Gerald and I and Travis Gannon at NC State did a project following up on this a few years ago in Bermuda grass that I'm sure Gerald will touch on.
Yeah, so this is actually a slide that shows an accumulation of several research projects, anything from tall fescue to Kentucky bluegrass to some fine fescues as well. And really what this is just trying to show is that, you know, as you increase mowing height, and obviously this is in centimeters, you are decreasing crabgrass cover. So at the lower mowing heights, you're having a lot more pressure. And as you increase the height, you're actually decreasing the amount of crabgrass cover that you're having to deal with. So again, I understand that sometimes it's hard to increase mowing heights or adjust mowing heights on athletic fields, but there may be some times during the year when that is possible. If it does coincide with certain weeds and their pressure, maybe that's something that you can do to kind of alleviate some of that pressure and again, make some of your herbicide applications a little bit more effective. This is some work from another former student who now works for Corteva. And this is from some of his master's work, Jared Hoyle. Again, looking at crabgrass cover. And again, this is in tall fescue, and we're dealing with some pretty tall grass here versus some relatively short. So as you go from left to right, you go from a 4 or a 1 inch mowing height where you have almost 80% crabgrass cover, you know, down to a 2 inch height where you still have about the same amount of pressure. And as you get to about a 3 inch height, you know, you've cut that significantly down to about 30%. And then at 4 inch height, you have zero pressure whatsoever. And we'll kind of allude to why that occurs here in a second as I go through some more slides. Just kind of showing you a couple of pictures here. Obviously, I don't expect anybody to play soccer on a 4 inch tall fescue grass here, but again, kind of showing you the major impact of some of these adjustments in cultural practices. You see the 4 inch tall fescue in the upper left corner there. Hard to see any weed pressure. And then on the lower right corner, the 1 inch tall fescue, all of that sort of light green color is the amount of crabgrass pressure that is present in those plots in response to that mowing height. So at that mowing height, your tall fescue is somewhat at a disadvantage. That's not a preferred mowing height for the grass. And you have a lot of light that is now getting to the surface. So you have enhanced germination and subsequently a lot more crabgrass pressure in response to that. So this kind of brings me to the density effect issue. And when Jim and I put, you know, control studies out, you know, we look for plots or areas that have significant weed pressure. We want to see, you know, north of 50% cover because we want to make sure that when we test some of these chemistries, they're actually working. And that kind of goes hand in hand with, you know, some of the cultural practices and how if you can decrease pressure, decrease that density effect, you're going to have a better result with some of your post-emergent herbicides. So I have the question on here, which population is easiest to control with a post-herbicide? It's kind of a no-brainer that the one on the right, where you have less weeds, is going to be a little bit easier to control. And even if you wanted to, it lends to the potential for a spot treatment application versus a broadcast application. So again, reducing the overall inputs of herbicides in this scenario. And a lot of this comes back to the ease of application here. So regardless of whether you're using a contact material or a systemic, the less weed pressure you have, the easier it is to get good cover of these weeds. Even with a systemic, if you were to have the pressure that showed here on the right, even with, you know, translocation within the plant, if you have poor cover, it's going to lead to a decrease in absorption of the material. The less material absorbed usually translates to less translocation throughout the plant. So again, it's great that systemics are able to kind of work through this to a certain extent, but when you have exorbitant amounts of weed pressure like you do on the right, any application is going to be difficult. So moving into some pre-emergent herbicide work here, obviously target species end up being annual grasses, some annual broadleaf weeds, and to a certain extent, some perennial broadleaf weeds. A lot of times we're getting some stunting. It really depends on what these weeds are growing back from. If they're weeds that are germinating from seed, yes, we can get some control, but a lot of times if they're coming back from vegetative material, it's more of a stunting that we observe. You're looking at spring applications, initial applications, and this varies. Obviously, it's been varying quite a bit in the last couple of years because we've heated up a lot sooner than later. Typically late February to mid-March, and then trying to make an application of a sequential about 60 days later. That's going to be chemistry dependent. And then it's also going to depend on how many years you've used the same chemistry over and over. We start to see a little bit of reduction in soil residual activity simply because if you use the same chemistry, year after year, you can select for some microbes in the soil that then can break that material down a little quicker. And sometimes you may go from 60-day soil residual activity down to 45 and so on. So again, another reason for changing up your chemistries aside from herbicide resistance is trying to increase your soil residual activity or at least maintain that activity. Fall applications tend to be mid to late September. And again, that's going to depend on where you are and your weather situation.
And to follow up on that, one of the things that we as weed scientists are trying to do is provide you as field managers better guidance on when to start these pre-programs. And that varies, again, as Gerald said, by geography. It also varies a little bit by target weed. For something like crabgrass in spring, there's a lot of really good data out there to suggest that soil temperatures, 24-hour average soil temperatures. So not just go out at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and measure it once, but look at like your average soil temperature for the day at a 2-inch depth. Once that is 55 for 2 to 4 days in a row in springtime, those are conditions where crabgrass seed can germinate. And that's really where we try to provide guidance on starting a pre-program in the spring. Obviously, in southern Texas, that's going to look a lot different than it is in northern Virginia in terms of what calendar date those conditions occur on. So using something like soil temperature can help you. With something like crabgrass, that temperature also aligns with the blooming of, I think it's border forsythia, the yellow blooms that are so recognizable in spring. So I know a lot of folks here in Tennessee will use that as a guide as to when to start. For something like Poa annua, like we see on the screen here in the fall, obviously product selection is going to matter a lot, and that's gotten to become more complex as resistance issues in Poa annua have worsened. But one of the things we know about starting a program for control, had a student just finish up here, looked at Poa emergence in Tifway 419 and found that we saw our greatest emergence, at least here in Tennessee, at multiple sites when our 24-hour soil temperature in the fall was cooler than 70 Fahrenheit at a 2-inch depth, and we had some rainfall within a 7-day period. And those, once we checked both of those boxes, soil temperatures, 24 daily average in the 60s, and then some moisture, that's where we really started to see Poa germinate and emerge in that stand of 419. And those sorts of triggers give some guidance on when to start a pre-program really on any sports field, no matter where you're at.
Yeah, and there's some little tricks here too. Jim and I sort of have gotten to a point where we try to get people to apply spectacle in the fall simply because we know, based on soil residual activity, that if it heats up a little early, it kind of gives you a little bit of protection there. Speaking of also, things getting warmer earlier than normal, I try not to panic about that because I typically know that even if some weeds germinate, we're going to get a frost or two that's probably going to knock those weeds back and sort of act as sort of a natural, control option as well. So this list here is obviously not all inclusive. It's most of the chemistries that we utilize. There's a couple of new ones that Jim will talk about towards the end here. Just want to throw out there too that a lot of these are off patent. There's some generics out there. I've definitely tested the generics versus these name brand materials, and we rarely see any differences. I always tell people if the thing to pay attention to is the formulation. If it's a different formulation, there may be some differences in control, but normally they're going to be relatively similar. So I like to steal this slide all the time from Jim. This is a slide that dates back pretty far now. But it's just kind of showing you efficacy across the board with a lot of the materials that I showed in the previous slide, just to kind of show you that regardless of some of these materials, when it comes to something like smooth crabgrass control, you're getting a pretty good control here. 80 plus days of 95 plus control is relatively good. And a few of these, based off of soil residual activity, giving you a lot longer control. And again, noticing that Spectacle is giving you 95 plus control, 160 days out, is one of the reasons why we try to promote, or at least I promote this for fall applications more than spring or even summer applications in sports turf, because of the potential issues with interaction with rooting. So one of the things to point out, I'm not sure how many people watching this or listening to this today know about this, but there is sort of some regulatory issues with oxadiazone, Ronstar, where there is a registration review. Jim probably knows a lot more about this than I do, so chime in if you want to. But the big issue here is that this chemistry may be lost in sports turf outright.
That's right. The proposed interim re-registration decision was made in June, posted in August of last year. It was not favorable for sports turf. Sports turf uses would be entirely depleted. It would no longer be an option for use in our industry. I will say that this is one of the reasons to be active in an association like SFMA. I know that SFMA submitted a letter to the EPA about the importance of this active ingredient for use in sports turf, and how such a decision would really hamstring many of their members for using the chemistry. I know many of the weed scientists across the United States, Gerald and myself included, submitted a lengthy letter to the EPA about oxadiazone as a herbicide, its value as a unique mode of action compound, its fit as one of our only pre-emergent herbicides that doesn't impede root growth of the turf grasses we use on sports fields, and really advocated quite strongly that we can keep oxadiazone, and maybe we have some augmentations to the use pattern to get around some of the toxicity concerns that the agency had. But at the end of the day, advocate for not a total deletion. And we'll see where that stands. There's been no news to date. Gerald and I both recently returned from the golf industry show, or the GCSAA conference, I should say. Was hoping to get some new information there and did not. So I would expect that we'll know more about this in early 2022 about the fate of oxadiazone in sports turf. Fingers crossed it'll get to a place that we can all feel good about.
All right, so again, kind of simplifying some things, looking at application timing. We all know that for summer annuals, you're going to target an initial application in the spring, and you're going to come in and make a sequential, sometime in the summer, depending upon the actual material you're using and how much soil residual activity you can get out of those products. We know that winter annuals are going to start germinating sometime, potentially late summer, early fall, depending upon the actual weed we're talking about. And they're going to continue to germinate, a few months, depending upon weather conditions. That may be 1 or 2 months, it may be several months, also depending upon where you are in the country. So making an application sometime in late summer, early fall is what we would do to try and get control throughout the rest of that growing season. So one of the weeds that Jim and I interact with, and obviously this is more of a southern weed, is Doveweed. It's a summer annual. It's favored by low frequent mowing. It increases horizontal growth sort of through creeping stems. Can be transferred from one location to the next through mowing quite easily. And this is one of these weeds that we call a game changer. It doesn't really fit the mold for your typical summer annual weed. It germinates when soil temperatures are approaching 70 degrees, so it's a little closer to sort of a goosegrass germination timing. Typical pre-application timings may be ineffective because you don't have enough soil residual activity. There has been a little bit of work looking at Spectacle, Tower, Ronstar, and Pennant being most effective. And we definitely try to promote split applications, again, with the initial maybe in March, maybe a little later, again, depending upon where you are in the country. With a sequential, maybe a month later. This is also one where you almost have to prepare for a post-emergent application because it's going to outrun most of your pre-emergence, even if you offset the initial application later in the season. It'll germinate here well into what I would consider early fall. So it's one of those that creates some management challenges chemically. So if whatever you can do culturally to decrease the pressure is going to help you again. This is the paper that Jim was alluding to earlier, some pre-emergent herbicide efficacy work that we did with crabgrass among several universities, myself here, Travis Gannon at NC State, and Jim up in Tennessee. Looking at the herbicides that you see there listed below, quite a few different products on the market. And really what we were trying to do is to see if there was any difference in efficacy based off of the soil of the turfgrass canopy height that we were mowing at. And you can see the herbicides there listed along the bottom. The 1.5 inch mowing height there shows up in the green, and the 1/2 inch lower mowing height shows up in sort of that orange color. And we're showing percent smooth crabgrass control here. So this is really just showing you that the higher mowing height was leading to greater control, little chemistry dependent, but for the most part, it almost doubled some of the control with respect to certain chemistries here. And the theory was that maybe the lower mowing height was creating more sunlight that was potentially photodegrading some of the material that was sprayed and then potentially reducing soil residual activity. But we did some soil sampling analysis for that and saw no effect of mowing height on the residual herbicide activity. So a lot of it's probably contributed to the fact that, the lower mowing height allowed more light to penetrate into the soil, created more germination opportunities. That's what led to, less control at the lower mowing height and better control when the mowing height was raised to about 1.5 inches. So again, some of these adjustments that, you may not get up to 1.5 inches, maybe it goes from 1/2 inch to 1 inch, but some of these subtle adjustments in mowing height can have an impact not only on disease or weed pressure, but also on some of the herbicide efficacy as well.
And I think too, one takeaway from this, particularly in 2022, is, this could be the time to do something like this, where, you're in a world where your herbicides are probably more expensive than they've ever been before, and supply chain issues might make them harder to acquire than they've ever been before, right? So their value as just a resource, one can argue, is really high in 2022. So, particularly if you're managing a park and recs facility, a space where maybe you have multiple fields and your end user expectations aren't as high as if you were at a professional stadium or a collegiate field, moving the needle up on what your mowing height is to kind of preserve that active ingredient and position it to be successful. This could be a year to try it, and you can use this information maybe to justify to your superiors that this is rationale for giving it a go.
Yeah, and especially some of these facilities where you may have, a dozen fields and only 3 or 4 of them get used. What's the point of maintaining them at this low mowing height? If no one's going to really utilize them, maybe kind of experiment with the mowing height and see if it affects weed pressure on some of these other fields. And that's something I would at least go after. If you're not going to be able to rotate play through the fields, and maybe manage them a little differently so that you can decrease the potential for needed inputs in some of the lesser used fields and focus them on the fields that are utilized more. All right, that sort of segues a little bit into herbicide resistance management. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, and this is definitely an area where Jim is way more knowledgeable than I am. We all sort of promote the fact that you need to apply at labeled rates. One of the things, and Jim will probably say the same thing, that I don't want to say it annoys us, but it does bother us, is if you think you have an issue, a potential herbicide resistance issue, don't keep jacking the rate up to the point where you're spraying at a 3 or 4x rate and then noticing that you don't have control and then ask us to come over. We want to see some of these failures early on, where you're actually spraying normal rates and they're you have weed escapes. But you definitely want to apply labeled rates. You want to try to rotate modes of action, and then tank mixing is also another good way to sort of hold off, I guess is the best way to put it, the potential for resistance issues in some of the weed populations that we're managing. And this is a slide that we've probably utilized quite a few times. And this is some work that was done not too long ago, just kind of showing you the importance of rotations and mixtures. And really just simply put, this is the risk of developing resistance, herbicide resistance in 30 years. And the left bar that's in sort of a light blue color there, where no rotation has been implemented, you have about an 80% chance of developing resistance in the 30-year period. Now, if you go to the other 3 bars there in different colors, you notice that that chance is maybe 10 to 15% when you do something like either rotation or mixing different modes of action. So again, you're kind of holding that potential for resistance to an extreme minimum when you do some of these things that are suggested to decrease the onset of resistance.
And we've seen the industry go this direction. Many of you may work with vendors that are making available through early order pre-3 programs, right? And the whole idea behind that is, let's take 3 herbicides from different mode of action groups that Gerald's going to get into here and put them out in a mixture to try to help mitigate resistance issues. And then, Gerald, if you can back up one slide, I'd like to just highlight one thing here. In the bottom, you'll see that this group of researchers from Arkansas, they found that it only took 4 years if all you were using was ALS inhibiting herbicides for resistance to evolve to a meaningful level. And they defined meaningful as 20%. And that, I think, is really germane to what we do in sports turf. I've had several calls today from sports field managers about transitioning ryegrass out of overseeded Bermuda grass, saying, I need something that is going to give me the speed of transition I'm looking for and will also help me clean up maybe some POA problems or some winter broadleaf problems, or both. And really, most of the options we lean on pretty heavily are ALS inhibitor herbicides, right? Revolver's an ALS inhibitor, Monument's an ALS inhibitor, Katana's an ALS inhibitor, Tribute Total's an ALS inhibitor. That cohort of materials that we use for ryegrass transitioning, by and large, is ALS inhibitors. So if that's something where that's kind of been your backbone of what you're doing, if you're managing overseeded ryegrass fields, looking into whether it's the program on the Barricade label with reduced rates of Barricade, I think it's 6 to maybe 8 or 10 weeks before overseeding. That's something to consider working into a new program in 2022. If you are one who can use something like Progress in your program, working that into a mix in 2022. I know the sports field labeling there on Progress is a bit vague in terms of how things are worded, but moving forward, know that just kind of using that ALS chemistry alone is going to lead to a situation you don't want to be in.
All right, so that kind of brings us into this herbicide classification system that has been sort of popping up. I don't remember how long it's been in place, but you may have noticed this when you've purchased a new chemistry. that at the top there, kind of circled in red, it's telling you sort of the group with respect to the mode of action that herbicide belongs to. So this is actually not required by the EPA for a company to divulge this on the label. It's obviously highly encouraged, and most companies have done this. Not all, but I would say a significant portion of them are doing this because it's obviously helping you select something that's a different mode of action when you need to. So kind of going back to that slide with the pre-emergent herbicides, you can see here, we do have a lot of 3s on here. If we do lose the 14, again, we are losing another unique mode of action in the mix that we can rotate through. And some of these other modes of action may not be that effective on certain annual grass weeds that we would hope they would be. So again, really not a lot of options here to rotate through, especially when you eliminate one of the main products that we utilize quite a bit in sports turf. I'm just kind of reiterating the fact that these chemistries do not prevent weeds from germinating, which is extremely important. They're going to control these weeds as they do germinate, depending upon the chemistry, whether it's root or shoot absorbed. The plant, as it's germinating within the soil profile, is either taking the material up through the shoots and the roots. It may kill the plant off outright in the soil profile, or you may see some emergence and then death afterwards, but it's not preventing the weeds from germinating, and that becomes important here in a second. With my travels all over the place, this is actually a throwback picture to Lubbock, Texas, kind of passing by a home lawn here and seeing that, tractor dye can be sort of a pain if it shows that you have some inconsistencies in your application technique. I can't tell if this is some skips or maybe some double application overlaps. But again, just really what this reiterates is that application technique is very critical. So if you do have some skips or large gaps in your herbicide barrier, it's going to result in some weed escapes. So you're going to get some weeds that are going to germinate. They're not going to come into contact with any herbicide, and they're going to pop through. And then at that point, you're basically relying on post-emergent herbicides. So when you get to, when you look at annual weeds and you look at post-emergent herbicide options, we really reiterate that you want to target small weeds. The smaller they are, the easier they are to control. So you want to apply, obviously, prior to seed production, you want to try to limit the amount of seed that's produced by these plants that then contributes back to the weed seed bank. Sometimes we're using the addition of surfactants to try and get better control or maybe better application to the surface of some of these specific weeds. And then obviously sequential applications may be necessary depending upon the age of the weed, the rate, the time of year, and so on. So using goosegrass as an example here, you obviously want to target the plants on the left before they start to tiller out. Once you start to get multi-tillered goosegrass, we don't have a whole lot of options that are very effective, aside from using, honestly, a shovel or pulling them out by hand. So when you do apply, when the weeds are relatively small, you have a better chance of actually getting control than when you apply to some of the monsters that you see there on the right. I don't know if you want to talk about this, some work that Jim's done previously, relatively recently, I guess.
Yeah, so this is a really good example of setting your herbicide up to be successful, kind of like we talked about earlier with the cutting height piece. And the idea behind the data that you see in the screen came out of kind of an observation amongst our group here that, where we see goosegrass, a lot of our test sites are these soils that are really compacted, lacking turf cover, and kind of by consequence, really dry. And we started to wonder, is that a reason why our herbicides that we use post-emergence for goosegrass control can struggle? And what we did was we grew goosegrass in soils of 2 different moisture contents, and we learned that that has a big factor on herbicide performance. What you see on the screen on the far left side, those different colored bars, they represent all of the post-emergence herbicides that we use for goosegrass control. across warm and cool season turf grass at full label rate with all surfactants per label directions. And you'll notice that when these are applied to goosegrass in soils of less than 12% volumetric moisture, not one of them control goosegrass more than 25%. And when we put the same herbicides down, same rates, same sprayer, same applicator, but now we're treating goosegrass and soil moisture greater than 20%, our overall control kind of skyrockets, right? Where something like Tribute Total at 3.2 ounces in the dry environment, we're 20% control. That application in the environment where we have adequate soil moisture, upwards of 90% control. So a really big shift just with the plant available water component accounted for.
Just a couple of pictures here to kind of reiterate what Jim said. You can see on the left, obviously, when the soil moisture is lacking, you're not getting really good control. Some green plants. You look on the right. This is the Tribute Total application that he was referring to earlier. You can see that the plant on the right is struggling and actually is probably on its way out.
So this is really simple, you know, if you've invested in one of these premier herbicides for goosegrass, you know, check your moisture application with a moisture meter. If you don't have moisture meter, just kind of use your head and treat when you know moisture is sufficient. You know, I joke with field managers that, you know, if you walk from your shop to your sprayer, or your shop to your truck, and you know, you kick up dust along the way because it hasn't rained in 3 weeks, it's probably not the time to go try to win the war on goosegrass, you know, to save that battle for another day, knowing that moisture can really affect the performance of whatever active ingredient is that you've selected.
All right, so that moves into perennial weed control. This is my third class of the day, so I'm losing my voice. So the key thing here to see is that you go from basically seed production to both vegetative and seed reproduction. So you're dealing with a completely different monster here. And really what it means is that reliance on herbicides alone is not going to provide you with the amount of control that you're going to need. So we typically get minimal control with pre-herbicides. And then we need to make sure that we're utilizing the correct post-herbicide and making sure that the application timing jives with the physiology of the plant and allows us to get the most control possible. So this is just kind of an example here looking at purple nutsedge control. Again, Dismiss is a really good herbicide for yellow nutsedge control, but it never really is consistently giving us purple nutsedge control. So this is control about 3.5 months after application, and you can see less than 50% control with Dismiss or similar products. And then when you compare it to something that has been successful in the past, Certainty and Monument, you know, we get upwards of 85% control. So again, using the right chemistry in the right situation. This is kind of further reiterated with some work we did this past year in the greenhouse. This is Vexus. Jim will probably allude to this chemistry a little bit later. Permesulfan, and it is a very good purple nutsedge control product. And this is comparing Vexus, the top row there. That is the amount of leaf tissue left on the purple nutsedge plants 60 days after application. The amount of tubers that were produced, they were originally 7 tubers at the beginning of the study, and they pretty much were held in check 60 days after. And the right column there is rhizome production. And as you can see, the bottom row there, as you go from left to right, that is Dismiss, the amount of leaf production, tuber production there, and rhizome production on the right. So almost a 10-fold increase in tuber production in response to an application of sulfentrazone, simply because it's not very effective at controlling purple nutsedge compared to some other products. I'm going to kind of go from here using Dallas grass as sort of an example perennial species. I know this is not a problem for everybody. This is just one that I've done a lot of research with in combination with cultural and chemical practices. So again, just using it as a example species. We know this is difficult to control weeds simply because of the amount of rhizome production that you see here in the picture. So one of the things to do with plants that have a lot of rhizome or vegetative growth production is to try and use mowing to reduce weed colonization. So this is some old research I've done in the past, looking at depleting carbohydrate reserves through biomass reduction. Similar work's been done with sedges and a few other things, even some broadleaf weeds. This is just looking at hay grass and Dallas grass at multiple mowing heights and compared with a non-mowed. And really what this boils down to is that mowing height and frequency has a really large impact on the hay grass growth because the rhizomes are somewhat shallow and they can be wounded quite a bit from lower mowing heights, but not as much of an impact on Dallas grass. So again, understanding, how some of your cultural practices, affect some of these weeds is extremely important. So again, looking at rhizome weight in response to a 1/2 inch versus a 2 inch versus a 3 inch versus a non-mowed, you can see obviously a non-mowed Dallas grass plant is relatively tall and bulky, so it's going to outcompete any mowing. But when you compare the 3 mowing heights, which are pretty dramatic from one another, you don't see much of a difference in rhizome production and weight. So mowing is really not something that's going to be advantageous to trying to reduce the colonization of this weed, but it could be for others. Soil moisture may be a different thing here. This is looking at Dallas grass, but hay grass in competition with Bermuda grass and by themselves. We look at a soil moisture gradient in the greenhouse, which allows us to basically compare the growth of these weeds across everything from full inundation and flooding to drought. And obviously this research is showing that Dallas grass may be more competitive with Bermuda grass when soil moisture is high, while Bahia grass is the opposite and it's more competitive when soil moisture is low. So soil moisture adjustments, this is some more data from that paper. Again, looking at Dallas grass, again, doing better at the lower end of the tank, which is on the left, where moisture is a little higher. As you go to the right side of the graph, things are getting a little droughtier. You can see Dallas grass starts to decrease rhizome weight. At that point, it's also, I don't believe I have the data in here, but it's experiencing about 50% mortality at that point as well. And what that kind of leads into, yes, sir.
We're getting pretty close to the top of the hour. And I know a lot of these folks probably need to get on their way to attend to some other things with their fields. We probably, I don't know if you want to share some takeaway wrap-ups or something to kind of close us out, because I've got 3:03 on my watch right now. Yeah, I mean, honestly, really what we're trying to reiterate here is that the chemistries by themselves are not going to give you the control you want. With a lot of the fluctuations that we're having in weather, a lot of the limitations that we're now having with specific use of certain pesticides, herbicides included, you're having to do a lot more things than you have in the past to get adequate control. And that's going to be looking at some cultural adjustments, from things that you're doing to things that, nature's doing to try and get you the best control that you can. Relying heavily on the chemistries is not enough. And, trying to lessen the weed populations is kind of the way to go. And then using those chemistries correctly when you need them is going to give you the best control possible. You got anything else to say there? Yeah, no, I mean, I would second all that. And I think, if we have some folks from the Northeast right now that are listening, they've been doing this for several years, right? As their legislators have imposed maybe more stringent laws in the Connecticut region and New York region and Massachusetts about what we can and cannot do on a sports field. They're accustomed to this idea of we're going to do some more things culturally to try to move the needle the right direction on the weeds that we need to get rid of from whatever field it is we're managing. And, we're not at a place in the transition zone or southern US right now where those it's the same situation. We could certainly get there. I mean, I think everybody on this Zoom is familiar with the public pressure that was put on glyphosate pre-pandemic. Some of that's starting to alleviate, some of it's still there, depending on where you are. That is largely non-science-based pressure and probably won't go away anytime soon. So understanding these cultural practices, I think, will matter. Not only does it help you, and we don't have time to go into great depth on the cohort of new herbicides that are out there right now, but certainly as you use them, I hope one of your takeaways from today is that what you do culturally will affect the efficacy of the herbicides you still can use. So this is my Twitter handle and email. You can reach out to me there with more questions. I'm sure, Gerald, you will share yours and your fancy national championship photo too.
That's not me holding the sign. Yeah, same thing. If you have any questions, obviously, a lot of the questions are probably going to be, chemical control questions. Feel free to reach out. The easiest way, honestly, to get in touch with either one of us is probably through email. You'll probably get a better response that way.
Correct. Yeah, for sure.
And yeah, my Twitter handle's here and my email address. Again, we both worked in northern climates as well. So if you have any questions, if we can't answer them, I'm sure we can put you in touch with somebody that can.
Thank you for listening.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, you can follow up with the emails that they shared. So thank you all for joining us today. We do have another presentation today that starts at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Paul Cushing will be presenting Revitalizing Your School District Sports Fields. So make sure to register and join us for that presentation in a few minutes. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the week.